Hello, and a very warm welcome to Question and Answer with the Arnolfini as part of the Writer in Residence programme. My name is Dr. Anne Harbin, and I'm the Associate Head of Department for Media Production and Journalism here at the University of the West of England. And I also run and look after journalism and media programmes here at the university, and we have a very close relationship with the Arnolfini. We're joined today to talk to Melissa Chemam. Melissa, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, Anne. I'm very happy you're here with me to talk about this project. So my name is Melissa. I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, and I've been the writer in residence at Arnolfini for over 2 years now. We'll explain why anyhow. I worked most of my life on international news and arts and culture. So I was based in different places, for instance, in Florida, in Europe, in the UK, and in East Africa, Central Africa. Traveled all over Africa to the different part of Africa. So when I moved to Bristol and started working with Arnolfini, I had sort of an angle and a special interest having written on African artists for over a decade.
And of course, the Arnolfini is one of the sort of international centre for contemporary arts here in Bristol since 1961, I believe. And it's here to celebrate the history and has had quite an impact on the city. And as part of that celebration of history and impact, we're here today to talk about Here, There and Everywhere, 60 years of the African diaspora artists. So Melissa, tell us a bit about your relationship with Bristol.
Right, so I came to Bristol about 7 years ago now because I was actually working in Central Africa and I came back to Europe and I had a bit of a moment of disorientation somehow because I worked a lot with refugees and NGOs and post-war, post-conflict situations where I felt like the media was a bit powerless to my view to help the people that I was working with. So I decided to focus on more positive responses to events. And a friend of mine is a music journalist, and I kind of came up with this idea to write about music that is political, that is very social, and that is linked to all these cultures that have been part of my life. And that's when I came across an article about Bristol music and, for instance, the music of the band Master Attack. I came to Bristol to write that book. It actually happened, and the book came out in France 5 years ago, almost to the day, and in England 2 years and a half ago. And I decided to move to Bristol because I fell in love with the city, its energy, its creativity, and its people. And now, of course, I work at UWE as a journalism lecturer, part of the media production team. So that's just become my new place on top of other place. So this sort of like, living in your head in a multiple environment at times, but Bristol's my base and has my heart.
So how did you end up becoming writer in residence at the Arnolfini?
Yes, that's a wonderful story for me, and I hope it will inspire other people. So Arnolfini often had a placement for writers in residence, which included to write for their website mostly, to write some blogs about the exhibition and response from different communities to the exhibitions. For instance, for the ones listening who know her, Cleo Lake was a writer in residence for a while. And so when I moved to Bristol 2 years ago, when I started lecturing, Arnolfini was looking for a writer in residence, and I had followed Cleo's work and I applied. So they set up very open call to become a writer in residence, and I sent a proposal that included references to the fact that I lived abroad and I'm not from England, and that I had this strong relationship with Bristol culture for the reason I mentioned before. And that was supposed to last 3 months. But then other exhibition after the one you see here, Still I Rise, came about, one from Amak Mahmoudian, who's also a lecturer in photography at UWE, and Angelica Mesiti, and they were very related to topics that I've been writing about. So one was about assembly and how to relate people together, and the other one was about displacement and living your home culture behind and integrating somewhere else and living with all this ghost of familiarity in your art. So I carried on a couple of months, and then lockdown happened. So we all got a bit stuck, and I don't know if it got stuck with me, or I kind of remained, and we kept on with this idea of writing a few blogs about how people deal with lockdown and how art can help, even though we were online. And from there, one of the person that is very dear to me now and works on a project of writers in residence decided that we should carry on with a project that's a bit long term for the anniversary of Arnolfini, and that has resulted to this book.
I mean, one of the things I found when I was looking through the book was that it's quite a long period of history to sort of be looking at African art. I mean, how challenging was it to research all of this?
Well, yes, exactly. So I had a very strong relationship with some events at Arnolfini in 2015, for instance, when I first came to Bristol. Because of the geography of Bristol, I ended up very quickly at Watershed and Arnolfini. So I spent a lot of time there. And then I came every month for a while when I was writing, and then every term. But of course, I wasn't there for the previous years. What happened is, like, it was obviously 2021 was supposed to be an anniversary year for Arnolfini, and it's been through a lot of different phases. It was very praised when it opened in the 60s, and then you had difficulties in the late 90s, and then it, reopened again. So I had to go through the archive, for instance, to find some documents that could help. There was also obviously a huge divide between the years on we all live online since the come about of the internet, where it's so much easier to find on the Arnolfini website photos and programs and events that happened in the gallery, and pre-internet. So I had to go to the archives when it was strictly closed. So I had to wait and to set up a special meeting, to use the gloves, to be in sort of a bubble, and to dig into the archives, mostly from the 70s and the 80s, because obviously what's striking with this history is that very early on for Arnolfini, they had a third artist that was from Sudan in 64, Hussein Sharif. But it didn't happen every year, because obviously in the 60s there were not so many African or Caribbean British artists exhibited in the whole of the UK altogether. So that was one of the interesting sort of balance to find how we're going to deal with the different period. And finally, the book is divided in three main period. The launch of Arnolfini first years, then the mid part where Bristol was completely changes through the 80s and 90s, and then more contemporary times where obviously international art became one of the heartbeat of what Arnolfini does.
So why don't we start at the beginning, because I like to do that. Talk us through some of the artists that you wrote about, maybe ones from the 60s and then moving forward.
Yes, exactly. So as I said, I am from Paris, and I lived in lots of places in Africa, and my mom's from Algiers. I've also been to Haiti, Kenya, Central Africa. And the first artist I wrote about was also from Africa. He's from Sudan, so he's called Hussein Sharif, and he was a fantastic person with a fantastic history. Became a painter really young and came to be trained in England, and he was exhibited in a few places. But Arnolfini was really pioneering in that sense, that they had an exhibition, as they like to do, because they have many floors, and they changed building. So it was a different building at the time on the Triangle, if you know Bristol. And he was the first African artist to be exhibited, and he was probably like the fourth artist exhibited altogether in Arnolfini. And he was doing very much abstract painting, so I don't have any archives with me because they're quite rare, but you'll see some in the book when it's getting printed at the moment. And he was very much inspired by his homeland and by cinema. He later moved on to do films and expanded cinema art films himself, so he kind of worked around his images. And then, of course, we have artists from the 70s, pretty much people inspired by hip hop and, reggae and the sound system culture. So one is called Mass Movers. They were a collective that were involved with Simple's Carnival. And then came some artists from different part of like Black Art Movement and all this sort of new collective that came about in the 80s. One is Veronica Ryan. Another one is the Black Audio Film Collective. That was set up by John Akamfra. John Akamfra is one of the key artists I wrote about, because he founded the Black Audio Collective. That was pioneering with very strong films about Black culture in the UK, including one on Strott Hall, one on Goldie later on. And then he became a filmmaker as himself, doing documentary films and art films. And he had an exhibition later on called Vertigo Sea in 2015, which is the actually it started in early 2016, just a few days of 15 over the winter, and it was one of the main exhibitions that I wrote about for this book. But I also mentioned an exhibition called Trophies of Empire that was really key for Bristol and for Arnolfini. That's happened in 3 different cities, not only Bristol. We went also to Hull, and it was a reflection on decades and centuries of colonialism in 1992, because of course it was 400 years of the start of the colonization of the Americas, and so all the impact it had on the relations between North America, Britain and Africa. And that was a very key moment that you'll get to know more in the book. This is a photo of a talk we had at Arnolfini way before I became, before I started the book, like a few months when I was writer in residence, was Kiss Piper, one of the artists that I've interviewed for the book. And here is the work of another artist that unfortunately passed away, Donald Rodney, called Double Think, reflecting on this idea of sport being associated with Black people more than maybe art, and also this idea of trophies and the legacy of imperialism and colonialism. So that's a very provocative piece that he left for that exhibition. Then of course that takes us to more contemporary work. So for instance, Frank Bowling was exhibited this year, and he's one of the longest working Black artists from Britain that has a very different view on being a Black artist. He's very much less recognizing himself as a person of color. He just wants to be associated and known as a painter first and foremost, and he believes in art for the sake of art, and he associates his art with poetry very much, and he does abstract painting, and he feels like it's not because you are Black that your art should be political on that strict level. He feels like, you know, as a Black person, he should be entitled to talk about any political discourses and not only race issues. So that's an interesting perspective, that not all artists have got the same view of what it means for them to be from the Caribbean, from Africa, or actually from Africa but not Black, because some of these artists are also from Africa over there, from North Africa or South Africa, and they have a different relationship with race. So that's a few
Yes.
examples.
Yeah, no, that was one of the things I thought was really interesting as I read through the art book, that it seemed that there was, you mentioned displacement earlier, but it also seems that there seems to be different people identified differently, and it doesn't depend on what country you come from. It depends on who you identify. So there were some Caribbean artists identifying as African, and there were some African artists identifying as Caribbean. And it's kind of interesting. So I think one of the things that it really highlights in the book is that can you actually identify people for the different places that they're from to cover all Black people? And I thought that's quite an interesting question that the book was sort of posing towards the end.
Yes, it was the puzzle from the start, because Arnolfini said, you've been to Africa so much, and we have all this work that has not been really gathered together. That's how they had the idea in April last year, so way before the unfortunate drama in America, the death of another Black person in America, and the Black Lives Matter movement coming about. So that was a very strong intuition. But of course, it's many artists and they all have different views. So how could we find threads, and what was the common narrative for some of them? And it was interesting to go from an explanation to another and see how it's changed through the decades. But I think the theme of displacement is probably one of the strongest, because many of these artists actually just identify as British, or some of them as African American. And you know how it is for African Americans. Some of them have never been to Africa, and they don't feel they relate. They feel have invented a culture of themselves in the US, and it's very important. There's an exhibition about Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance movement that took place at Arnolfini that we mentioned, that was very powerful. But for a lot of people, it's about how to define themselves as Americans, because they've never been on the soil of Africa. It's far away. They will never learn the language. They don't have the same religions, but they are visibly different from other Americans because of their skin. But they don't want to be identified to their skin color. They want to be a person with complexity, different cultures. On the other end, in Britain, a lot of artists identify as Black, but they have no strong link with the Caribbean or Africa for this very same reason. They're working class, they haven't traveled there, and if they do, or if they have, it's still a foreign land. So it's all of these questions about identity, but what all of the artists have in common, whether they're from Egypt, Sudan, which is between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, so it's a complex land, and it's interesting to start with there, or from the rest of Africa, or from the Caribbean, or from the Western countries. We all have a past of a family that's been forced to be displaced, or has been relating to different cultures. Some part of it has been stolen. It could be the language, it could be the artistic references, it could be the music our parents listen to and that we've tried to shy away from, like any teenager would, and then rediscovered later on, that influenced a lot of these artists. And there's also a few like English or Irish or Italian artists that have been heavily influenced by Black culture and have been pioneering in the way they worked with Black artists, that are also part of this story because it's Bristol. And, you know, again, people like Tricky, who was raised by his white family, mostly in Northwest, and identify with the white working class. I've been really defining of Bristol music as a Black artist. So there's all these complicated questions that come around.
Yes, I know. I think it's quite interesting that we've managed to do a lot of talk about art, and we haven't actually yet mentioned the Wild Bunch, or even mentioned some of the things that Bristol's quite iconic for, which is the graffiti art as well. So I noticed there are some images in the book that cover that sort of period.
Absolutely, because Arnolfini had an interesting show in 1985 that is considered to be the first graffiti show in an art gallery anywhere in Europe, I think. And that was at the moment where the Wild Bunch was at its high, and I think it was very young street artists like Nick Walker and Inky. At the time, they were teenage boys that went to see Jeremy Reese at Arnolfini and said, we need to have a show about graffiti. And they went to see Robert Del Naya at the time, who was the graffiti artist for White Bunch, way before they found a massive attack. And they made that show happen, and he invited friends to actually paint on the walls, and his other friends to DJ. So the rest of the Wild Bunch, so the Caribbean DJs, brought up the Caribbean music that was very much linked to graffiti. But at the time, the graffiti writers were all white, because it was also coming from punk. And as you know, all this music scene was this sort of like marriage between soul music, funk, punk, ethos, like DIY, not having money, recording with samplers, and of course the hip hop vibe, rap on top, lyrics for people who couldn't sing in the same way, and very beautiful soul vocals. So that pioneering event called Graffiti Art happened at Arnolfini, and obviously I was lucky enough to interview some of the artists. They also invited someone like Goldie, that maybe people listening to this talk might know very well, who also started as a graffiti artist and then turned to music a few years after Massive Attack, and was one of the pioneers of jungle music. So all this is kind of like haunting the walls of Arnolfini and the harbour of Bristol, and a lot of the artists that are mentioned in the book, people like Keith Piper, when they were invited to Bristol over and over again, they associated Bristol with the Bristol sound as much as, you know, the past and the slave trade, which is exactly why I wrote my book, to write a story that ends well, where migrants are finally the heroes and not only the, you know, carrying on the burden of suffering from their ancestors, but creating their own culture to move on from there. So it's quite cheerful.
So I'm kind of going to sort of maybe start bringing this to a bit of a close now, and maybe just ask you, it's an awful question to be asked, but you know, like, what's your favorite artist? But not sort of favorite, but what's something that really sort of hit home to you, or some, you know, one of the artists that you actually thought, yeah, I can really resonate with that.
Yeah, there are obviously a few. Keith Piper was probably the most interesting person to talk to, because also he's full of energy and he's got a great sense of humor, and his work around Trophies of Empire is very defining. It's very multimedia centric. And then John Akamfra for me was a revelation, because I worked with a filmmaker myself who's from Haiti, Raoul Peck, and they actually are friends. And I had discovered old work of John Akamfra through Raoul, and then Vertigo see at Arnolfini. That is one of the most powerful piece of art film that I've ever seen in my life, I think. So this digging into his own work as his filmmaking, the Black Audio film. That was really an interesting moment. I listened to a lot of talks with him. I corresponded with his producers, and he's sort of like probably less known than someone like Steve McQueen that does films that end up in a cinema, on television, on the BBC, because his work is very artistic. But it is quite eye-opening, even though it's difficult to watch. So I think this one's, and of course Robert Del Naya from Massive Attack, and the way he went from graffiti music to music video and an art film, and all the work he does now that is so socially aware and still very much linked to Bristol. He's also created many platforms now for Bristol to recover from the crisis, from COVID, for musicians, for films. You know, they kind of like, it completely changed my view on the world, and that's probably why I'm so attached to the city now.
Well, Melissa, it's been lovely talking to you. It's really, really interesting hearing all your thoughts on all the work and the research that you've actually done. I'd just like to say thank you very, very much for joining me for question and answer as part of the Arnolfini Writer in Residence
Thank you
program.
so much. Thank you so much for taking the time being with us. And it means a lot for us that UE, and especially your program, is associated with this story.
Thanks a lot. I'm a waver, so I'll wave bye. Bye, everyone.